The Miracle of Morgan's Crick is a screwball comedy directed by the legendary Preston Sturges, starring some larger-than-life comedic actors in Betty Hutton and Eddie Bracken, or was he smaller than life? Maybe. We'll talk about all these people in this very video, and we'll try to get to the bottom of what, if anything, this Mad Capra comedy is taking aim at. What's it actually about? The Miracle of Morgan's Creek is from 1943. I am fascinated by movies about World War II made during World War II. A lot of people introduce this movie as being subversive, or as being defined by the lengths it went to skirt the production code. How did they get this made? It's a miracle. It made it past the censors. But like I said, what is it really about? The plot of the movie is both fairly straightforward and extremely not straightforward, all over the place. It follows a young woman named Gertrude, but Trudy to you and me, living in a small creek in a small town called Morgan's Creek. This is Betty Hutton's character. Trudy is probably about 17, and her younger sister, Emmy, is 14. Of course, teenagers had not been invented yet, so it's an interesting look at domestic life at the time. Emmy is played by Diana Lynn. Their father is the town constable, a single father played by William Demarest, a legendary kind of character actor. Our story starts with Trudy desperate to attend a party. A party for whom? For those brave young Morgan Creek men who are headed off to war. Which war? World War II. I'm not going to spoil anything about this movie, including the end, which is one of the greatest twists I have ever seen. Truly, one of the greatest twists I have ever seen. I'm also not even going to really tell you what happens like after half an hour into the movie. If you read the little blurb about this film on IMDb, it will tell you a fair amount of the plot. I'm not going to do that. It will compromise the video slightly, but this is a movie worth watching, so I'll let you do that. I'll tell you that she does go to the party with the assistance of local dweebish 4F Norval, played by Eddie Bracken. From here, the plot blooms zanily in all directions. Although at its core, I guess it's a romance between these two. If there is one piece of logic that most grounds the film, even as the plot is going all over the place, it's the sheepish Norval trying to court Trudy, who mostly has zero interest in him. Let's talk about a few technical things. This movie has a number of long takes, long shots of Trudy and Norval walking down the street, walking down, this little residential lane in Morgan's Creek. This is not very common for 1943. Preston Sturges didn't have to do this. These shots aren't particularly funny, or it doesn't make it more funny that it's a long take. And actually, in some ways, they don't stand out that much, although you'll probably notice them if you're attuned to this whole cinema thing. There was some ambition putting these in, when in some ways they don't need to be there. This is a movie about small town America. It's set in the same town where Frank Capra so often worked. Mostly this town seems to be made out of Hollywood sets. It wasn't filmed in any real place. It was on the Hollywood backlot, I think, the ranch. We do have a number of outdoor locations in the movie. You know, the street, like I said earlier, a couple exteriors of shops and such, but we don't really see the town itself, and maybe that's unsurprising because the town didn't really exist. It's interesting that this film about small-town America is sort of a composite of various domestic locations, the bedroom, the dining room, the front porch, and some professional locations like the bank, the doctor's office, the lawyer's office, the jail. Cars are another big part of the story. This is pretty standard stuff, I suppose. It was how movies were made, and it was how movies could be made, but it is somewhat interesting to see how exactly small towns and small town America were made into images on the screen. If you watch a similar movie from maybe a decade later, you would probably see a little bit more of the town, but maybe not much. It took a long time to actually show like a bustling town square. Well, there's some movies that do it, but anyway, I think you know what I mean. Of course, this is a comedy. Not this video, but the movie. Is it still funny? I think so. The Miracle of Morgan's Creek came out approximately 82 years ago, and movies tend to become less funny with every passing year. But this one really still has its moments, which means that at the time, it was probably fatally hilarious. Of course, it is a bit uneven today. Some of the jokes don't really land. Some of the pratfalls do land, but aren't particularly funny. Don't worry, there are a gazillion jokes in the movie, and there's sure to be at least one that you enjoy. A number of them, for me, were still, truly hilarious. there is a huge variety in the jokes, but probably the defining mechanic is this screwball comedy thing where you think things have gotten as ridiculous as they could possibly get, and then guess what? They get more ridiculous. We've got this here in spades. Betty Hutton has a particular style, very energetic, a bit over the top. It can be a little polarizing maybe, but I like it. And I'm curious about some of her other movies. If you have any suggestions, let me know. Betty Hutton had an interesting life from the humblest beginning to considerable stardom, to depression, alcoholism, and retirement from acting. Eddie Bracken is not as interesting as far as I know, but he really holds his own as a comedic actor. Both of these guys bring a ton of energy, and they give us extremely vivid characters that are the perfect base for all the jokes that will play out. It is, in a lot of the sort of comedic vignettes in the film, it's all about the character playing off the character. Still, there is a little bit more depth to everybody than you might expect. These two actors are very physical, and there's all kinds of slapstick throughout. Personally, I think it's cool that Betty Hutton doesn't have just a straight part like a lot of women would in the 1940s. Not all of the slapstick works for me exactly, but pretty cool. What's most striking about The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, about the comedy in it, is the satirical stuff, the potentially subversive stuff. For instance, after her father forbids her from going to the dance, Trudy tries to convince Norval to take her there secretly. This is one of those long takes where they're strolling down the street, and she launches into this big spiel about how it just would not be right to send young men off to war without giving them a farewell kiss at the dance. She gets quite animated about all of this. Long take, big performance, pretty cool. Probably she doesn't really feel this way sincerely as much as she is putting on some patriotic guise so that she can convince Norval to take her to the party. Similarly, Norval explains that there's nothing he wants more than to be able to wear a military uniform, that he hates being a 4F and he would love to serve. And again, you feel the rays of satire coming from the screen. Do either of them feel this way? This is interesting because the soldiers and the war are sort of a sacred thing in America. And you could read this stuff different ways. Some might say that it is lampooning the army itself. Others might say that it's making fun of fake patriots who claim to support America but are selfish. Trudy eventually does find her way to the party, and the soldiers there, the brave young men heading off to war, are portrayed mostly as scoundrels. In fact, the film's defining drama revolves around a soldier being not exactly an upstanding young American, and this is surprising to see in 1943. Maybe things are pretty lighthearted in a sense, but they're also pretty dark in this movie. That said, the film is all over the place. It strikes out at so many things. I don't want to go line by line through all the satirical moments and try to keep score. Oh, it's saying this or it's saying that. I think there's a better way to describe what is actually happening here. First of all, who are we rooting for in this movie? We have our two protagonists, sure, but the reality is that they're both pretty naive. You root for them maybe because they have their hearts in the right place, but they also get hopelessly lost, completely turned around, and they do some things that protagonists aren't really supposed to do, like Trudy trying to manipulate Norval to get to the party, or Norval being completely spineless. He also doesn't seem to have any bones in his legs, for what it's worth. Usually the didactic thrust in a film is very closely connected to its protagonists, but it's a bit hard to conclude much from the wacky journey that these two guys go on. Still, there is all this satire, and there's this feeling that there's some sort of a point being made by it, perhaps. So what is that? Well, there are many moments in the film where characters draw from some kind of collective ideological pool, I would say. Living in this small town, they have a patchwork quilt of American ideas, and they are trying to do right by this thing. They are trying to follow the rules. Maybe bend them a little here and there, maybe get a leg up here and there, but they do seemingly want to be good Americans. This does not end up being as easy as it might sound. Trudy goes to the party, and things get pretty tricky pretty quickly. To make things right, Trudy goes to see a lawyer. But in typical screwball comedy fashion, she doesn't want to kind of ask directly about what's going on, so she sort of beats around the bush, and her indirection leaves everyone more confused than when they started. She gets an answer, okay, good, and she sort of latches onto that, another piece of American values, another piece of the quilt, she latches onto that, but, sort of she's holding it upside down or something like that. Like, it's not quite, things don't exactly add up. She gets turned around. Okay, let's follow the rules, but not realizing that maybe things are a bit mixed up, or perhaps that things didn't make much sense in the first place. Well, then they go to a doctor, and the same thing happens. When you watch a movie like It's a Wonderful Life, which came out after this, of course, you see all the pillars of the community. And whether they're good or bad, they're played straight, mostly, and they present this coherent view of the American idea. But in this movie, going around to the pillars of the community reads more like one long joke, with Trudy getting more and more turned around and more confused. Well, the doctor said this, but you know how doctors are. The lawyer said this, you know how lawyers are. You know how small towns are. You know how America is. She and Norval really just try to follow the rules, but doing so spawns a harebrained scheme and leaves the audience wondering, why are people so hung up on these things in the first place? What are these people thinking all around? If there is a singular didactic thrust to this movie, it is probably that the small town patchwork quilt just doesn't really hold up. It doesn't really add up. The apple pie doesn't really make sense. And this implicates the way that people look at the army and the war. It implicates the way that people look at women. And it also implicates religion, potentially. 3 pretty big themes of the film. Let me mention briefly that the scene with the lawyer is really great, a highlight on its own. I'm trying to be circumspect here, but it is a funny scene and unpredictable. And it also shows us a character that is brusque, who lords his legal knowledge over Trudy, but who is also actually kind of not a bad guy, who sort of wants to help her out. A classic picture of a man. So is this an anti-war movie? Not really. It's more one big joke about America, a shaggy dog story about patriots, men, and religion, and it's a joy. It's a joy to watch. Like I said, there's something special about a war movie made during the war. After the war, you're looking at a historical film. Things have hardened to some extent, but during the war, someone might make a topical joke that reminds you that there were real people there with real uncertainties and doubts. Topical humor always has a certain irreverence to it, I think, or it usually does, and we get that in this movie. There are a couple jokes about the Axis leaders. We actually see some of them in the movie, believe it or not. And these moments, they feel kind of like a meme that you would see today. The irreverence feels like it's hot off the presses a little bit. Often movies from the 1940s make that period seem really, really long ago, and in a galaxy far, never mind. And it's a little hard to tell how much of that is because it truly was a long time ago, and how much of that is because the classic Hollywood is a crude mirror. It has limitations of the films themselves, technical limitations, but also we had the production code, and we had a general nationalism and simplicity of Hollywood. We are looking at what today would be the most mainstream and the most milquetoast stuff out there, and we're trying to see real people in that, trying to see real people in the pharmaceutical ad on the television or something like that. Well, this movie, I don't know. It gives you a little bit more. It's not totally obvious to me, still, how the average person would have read all the pieces of it, but there is a spark of life in the miracle of Morgan's Creek that I wasn't really expecting. I think it's worth watching for that alone, but also, like I said, it's still genuinely quite funny.